Welcome to the PFF NFL betting show. We're here. It's a revamped cast of characters. We're going to be doing something different, but I'm super excited. I think at its core, betting is really kind of an expression of a particular idea, a particular thesis. It is really just that one way of kind of almost predicting what you think is going to happen. And I think a lot of the substance of what you can focus on is kind of the process that goes into that. Focusing on the games, the X's and O's, the data, all the things that kind of make PFF great. And we can, of course, we will always be talking about betting. We're talking about how we can kind of apply the intricacies of a game and matchups and players and markets and how all of that can kind of yield itself in a bet. We're going to cover all of that. Worry not. It will be a little bit of a revamp. We're learning. We're excited. Ben, why don't you tell us who you are? What do you do at PFF? What are you most looking forward to for this podcast?
Yeah, I'm excited for this, man. I've kind of the last couple of years have worked in the broadcast space, preparing the primetime broadcast, specifically Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night for their games. So talking through matchups, scheme, personnel with the broadcasters, with the production teams. And I've followed your work the last few years, and I'm super pumped to just be talking about these matchups on kind of a broader league-wide scale with you, and hopefully winning some people some money.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. I'm super excited. And I think, as has been, as you said, really going deep into games is kind of going to be the MO of this podcast. We're going to try and choose a few games every week. Oftentimes they'll be the primetime ones, the high-profile ones, which are often the most exciting, as it were. There's a reason they're on primetime after all. And we'll kind of focus on those. Hopefully can kind of pick up on some big themes, and we'll, of course, always hit on some kind of parlay bets. But, this is episode 1. We're all learning. We're all going to kind of iterate on this process. I can't wait. Why don't we start with game 1. Tonight's matchup, we've got the back-to-back defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs going up against the Ravens, rematch of the AFC Championship game. What are you looking for here?
Yeah, what a game, first off, right? It's tough to get much better than this. But I think the thing that I'm most interested in on both sides of the ball, really, offensively, is how some of the personnel changes this offseason kind of impact what these teams are looking to do ideologically. Starting with the Chiefs, it's kind of been a storyline that's been beaten into the ground, but you go back to early in Mahomes' career, he's airing it out downfield. You get all the too high stuff. And really the last couple years, and especially last year, they've become an offense where it's a lot of underneath stuff, and you're living on yak, and you're living on Mahomes' ability to buy time, right? Either to throw or to scramble, one of the best scramblers in the league. But this offseason, you go out and you add 2 guys with sub 4.3 speed in Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, right? So does that indicate that they're looking to get back to being more explosive and relying less on that super efficient underneath passing game that we've seen from them the last couple of years?
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of exactly right to highlight a lot of we talk a lot about stated preference. Like coaches all the time talk about, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But then there's a revealed preference of like the things they're actually doing. And they're spending a lot of capital on this speed to, I think, as you say, counteract a lot of these forces. And I'm super excited for it. As you said, Patrick Mahomes' depth of target, is decreasing every year. And this is kind of a new style of offense. And I think the matchup against Baltimore is actually particularly intriguing in that way. This is a defense that's changed a lot. Most notably, I think, losing coordinator Mike McDonald. They lost a lot of their positional coaches. Anthony Weaver's the defensive coordinator now. I think the market is almost pricing in this as like we're effectively just in week 22, let's say, of last season in 2023, when like these teams have changed a lot. And I think in thinking through week 1 in the general scheme of things, it's almost a question of like, okay, we have some certainty about certain things. and most of it's going to be uncertain. What we do know is that the Chiefs are going to be really good on offense. I think there's kind of this question of, well, how good can they be? And I think, to your point, a lot of that's going to depend on, like, is this going to be the Chiefs unit of 2018, 2019 air raid style? And on the Ravens side, like, they lost a lot everywhere. How are you kind of seeing the Ravens' losses? How do you think that kind of influences this particular schematic matchup here of this Chiefs offense, especially if they go more vertical against the Ravens now?
Yeah, it's a tough one to kind of juggle early in the season when Zach Orr is a guy, their new defensive coordinator, a guy who played for the Ravens for 3 years when McDonald was a coach there. He coached with McDonald when he came back there after he was with Michigan, right? He's someone who's been around McDonald, but I don't know if you can just say, right, you kind of lose the mastermind and this guy's going to bring the same stuff, right? It's the Ravens defense going into last year. I think my biggest question with them was, how are they going to generate pass rush? And then you saw McDonald with all the sim pressures, all the creative ways he was getting free rushers. That was why they were able to get the quarterback to the ground as often as they were. And there's still not a ton of talent on that defensive line. You're hoping for ascension from younger players like Odafe Oweh, like David Ajabo, right? Hopefully getting a full season there. But you still lose key pieces from last year, like Jadeveon Clowney, like Patrick Queen, even like a guy like Arthur Millette in the slot, right? I know they're playing Kyle Hamilton there, but now when they're kind of have three cornerbacks on the field, you got Marlon Humphrey inside, and then that other outside spot is like a combination of Nate Wiggins, the rookie, is probably the guy who's going to step in, all right? But last year they had Ronald Darby, Rock Yassin, so there's some turnover there. And I want to have faith in the Ravens just from an organizational standpoint and say they're still going to be a good defense, but I don't think they're going to be top of the league defense like we've seen from them or like we saw from them last season.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And the theme that I keep hearing here is there's a lot of hope, right? I.e., there's a lot of kind of projection of what this team could be. And there's a massive difference in going from being the best defense in the league to the 8th best defense in the league, right? And that's not the same as like the 8th best defense in the league going to the 15th best defense in the league. And then you tie it back to like what's actually being priced into the market right now, which is that like this is a top Ravens defense as they were last year. And that's kind of where I see a bunch of value on the Chiefs and why this is a spot that I'm really looking to attack, which is I think we're going to see a new Chiefs offense. I think we're going to see a vertical offense. We have so much of a sample of what Andy Reid can draw up, not to mention like outside of last year when they're without Kelsey, without Chris Jones, like they are historically good week one. That's obviously a tiny sample, but I think it illustrates the point of, right, you want to trust the guys that have been around a long time and have done it particularly well and are certain. That's a particular thing you want in week one. And kind of all the spots to me are lining up for a Chiefs spot here. Are there any players or matchups you think are particularly intriguing, from either the Chiefs offensive side or even just looking at kind of how the Ravens offense is going to play against the Chiefs? We haven't touched on that yet. Yeah,
I think on the Chiefs side, there is some opportunity here for the targets to be more concentrated, right? Because you have Hollywood Brown is out. Right? He's a sternoclavicular dislocation. Hopefully I got that one right. I'm not sure what that is.
No one will be able to correct you if you got it wrong. So,
but he's out, right? So that's one of your vertical threats. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how they use Xavier Worthy early in the season. Is it like all systems go right away because you don't have Hollywood? If you look at what they did with Rashee Rice last season, weeks 1 to 9, 45% of the snaps. The rest of the season, 76%, right? So they kind of worked him in slowly. And if you're assuming that Travis Kelce is kind of going to pick his spots during the regular season to keep him fresh for the playoffs, that either means Rashee Rice is going to get 20 targets or I actually kind of like Justin Watson, right? As a veteran who has experience in the system, his receiving line is 15.5 yards. His average depth of target is like 18 yards. That's one catch. And I think guys like Watson and Rice could benefit from some of the uncertainty at the receiver room early.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably my favorite SGP angle is looking at Justin Watson in particular. And I think it's for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned of this is a Chiefs team that historically has slowed their kind of rookies into it. It's like the one thing I think you can take away from the preseason is just like literally who was on the field, because that's going to be sticky of like who's going to be on the field in week 1. Justin Watson played on like 13 of the 18 dropbacks that Patrick Mahomes took. Like, he's going to be on the field. He is one of those guys that like pops in a lot of our kind of separation numbers. He's a top 5 separator. He can win deep. I think the Ravens are sneakily a little bit weak in the secondary, especially if the Chiefs are attacking vertically. I love the Justin Watson alts. If you get like a Mahomes 300, a Watson 50 or 60, Chiefs minus whatever it is, 4.5, 5.5, basically telling the story of Watson being the recipient of Mahomes' deep balls. You can get that at 30, 40, 50 to 1. Depending on the books and depending on how far you want to push the lines out. Yeah, that's absolutely one of my favorite angles there. I think the one piece of this game we haven't talked about is how does the Ravens offense kind of shape? And we talked a lot about the defensive turnover, but this is also an offense, especially on the offensive line, that lost a lot. How are you kind of seeing that in this game? How do you think that kind of influences the way this game might play out?
I think I'm most worried about their offensive line changes in pass pro. I think when I'm looking at it, just because I have so much faith in the floor of their run game with Lamar Jackson at quarterback. And I think the interesting angle with Derrick Henry coming in the rushing game is he's going to have more space to work with than he has for a long time. All right. If you look at just average formation width, so from one side to the other, shout out Anthony Tresh for pulling this last year. Notre Dame analytics, great. But they were 3rd highest in the NFL last year. And you kind of compare that to what they were under Greg Roman, and it's a lot of heavy personnel, more condensed sets. But they're a little more spread with Todd Monken. And that just means that in combination with the kind of the gravity that Lamar Jackson has as a runner and the respect that defenses have to pay him on those keeps, it should mean more room to run for Henry, right? And the offensive line is a concern. You've got 2 new guard starters. You've got a new right tackle starter. But I think in this spot, especially against the Chiefs defense, where they were much better against the pass than they were against the run last year, right? We kind of view them as a great defense, but they were 30th in EPA per play allowed on designed runs, right? So I think when you combine all that stuff, plus the fact that there's this whole narrative that the Ravens didn't run the ball at all in the AFC Championship game, and why didn't they run the ball? I think it's a good spot for Henry.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way of thinking of like how this game could play out, which I think the Ravens' path to victory is relying on Henry. That's a lot easier said than done, just because if you're going up against the Chiefs get the ball first. They score for whatever reason. One drive stalls out. A sack on 3rd down, which very likely to happen, especially given the issues in pass protection. And there is some compelling research on O-line continuity, and the Ravens do not have that at all. And Lamar Jackson, I think the almost thought is that he's a terrific scrambler, and he's pretty good at generating positive rushes, though much of his rushing production does come from design runs. He really struggles in his sack avoidance. And I think that is kind of magnified in this spot where they're losing an offensive line. So I think for the Ravens side, you almost need to like effectively hit on a long parlay, which is just like every drive be a lot of kind of this like methodical, use Derrick Henry, try and get a lead in this game. And I think they can succeed that way. But at the same time, that's a lot easier said than done against the Chiefs because the game script can really go against them. And if the Chiefs are able to kind of force the Ravens into obvious passing situations, I think that can spell trouble. But that's an interesting live angle, I think, to look at, which is that the Ravens, like playing from ahead, I think are certainly a more compelling case than one playing from behind.
Yeah, it's tough sledding for Henry if they get down big early, right? There's not many scenarios where he puts up a lot of production.
For sure.
And in the passing game, like you look at Chris Jones against Andrew Voorhees and Daniel Falele at guard, that's scary.
That's not the recipe I think you want on the Ravens side of things, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we talked about a lot. Just to kind of recap some bets that we're talking about. I think I'm curious how you feel about. I just think the like overall certainty of what we know about the Chiefs relative to the changes that the Ravens have undergone is kind of leading me to liking the Chiefs money line, the Chiefs on the spread, at least relative to what the market's pricing in, which is a team that is effectively very similar to last year, or maybe a little bit worse, when I think these are kind of fundamentally different teams. We talked about Justin Watson. I think that's a great angle, especially on the parlays, of leaning into the fact that the Chiefs are relatively slow to incorporate their new wide receivers into their offenses. Watson he's going to play. He's had some success, especially in the deep game. Not much really needs to go right there for him to kind of hit on a decent receiving day. And then I think we even just brought up another very interesting angle of the Ravens having success rushing and kind of the Chiefs pulling away a little bit later, in which you can kind of pick up on some of the inverse correlation of a Derrick Henry rushing game while the Chiefs still leaning on Mahomes to win. I'm curious your thoughts on kind of those angles.
Yeah, I'm kind of in alignment with that. I think the sort of aligned with what you said. I think my favorite angle is kind of Mahomes with Watson, and I don't even hate Rice, right? Like throwing in some Rice either. But Watson, obviously, you're getting a lot more there. It's low expectations. But yeah, and if the Ravens pull ahead, right, it's a good matchup for Henry in a vacuum. But if they're behind, then there's not much to go with.
For sure. So an exciting time in the NFL is that we have back-to-back games. So not just do we have a game tonight, but we got one tomorrow night. What are some of the kind of big storylines you're monitoring? What's kind of your sense of, I think kind of the central question, at least to me, for the Eagles is like, we had almost a year and a half of data that would suggest like the Eagles are a juggernaut, right? They go to the Super Bowl. They're controversial. I'm in Philadelphia. I hear all the time about all the different things that went wrong to the Eagles. But they were in a one-score game in the Super Bowl. They were 11-1 last year. It seemed like they were an offensive juggernaut and everything kind of collapsed. Obviously, they make some changes this offseason. Which sample size do you think is more relevant on the Eagles side of things? The Packers also had some interesting changes. How are you kind of looking at all of that in this week one spot?
Yeah, I think with the Eagles, I'm kind of leaning more towards they're not going to be a juggernaut. Like it's probably not going to be as bad as we saw at the end of last season. But the issue with them late in the year was you have this offense where Hurts wants to attack outside the numbers, right? They're not really attacking the middle of the field. He did not handle blitzing well at all, right? And that's kind of something that's gotten into the mainstream narrative around him. He had the most dropbacks of any quarterback against cover zero. He was our lowest graded quarterback against cover zero. All right. And when you lose Kelsey, who's handling protections and stuff at the line of scrimmage, that puts more on Hurt's shoulders in a new offense with Kellen Moore. And I think there's going to be a learning curve for this Eagles offense. Right. And there's still some elements, right? But you bring in Barkley. I still think their offensive line is going to be able to move the ball in the run game. And Barkley's going to have a lot more room to work with than he did in Green Bay. And you still have talent at receiver with Brown and Smith, and bringing in Jahan Dotson, which is something they missed. It's just like a capable number 3 receiver because they really had no one behind A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. But I think this matchup against Green Bay, because on that side of the ball on defense, that's a big change going from Joe Barry to Jeff Hafley as defensive coordinator as well. Hafley's someone who at Boston College the last 4 years as a head coach was 3rd in the Power 5 in man coverage rate or cover 1 rate, right? So that's a big change from the softer zone defense that you saw from Green Bay. And it's almost a situation where I look at Green Bay and I look at what the Browns did last year with Jim Schwartz, and you bring in an aggressive single high coach who wants to play man coverage. Obviously, Schwartz has been an accomplished DC in the NFL. Hafley has not. But there's a lot of talent on that Packers defense, man. It's loaded with first-round picks. And even some of the other guys like second-round picks like Xavier McKinney, big contract from the Giants, Javon Bullard, Preston Smith, right? There's a lot of talent at all 3 levels, and they address some of their issues in the secondary. So I think they're one of those teams that can make a big jump defensively. And you have a top 10 defense with what we saw from them on the offensive side of the ball last year. They're going to be a Super Bowl contender.
Yeah, that's I think a great overview. And the way I kind of react to that is twofold. One, it's that you look at a new coordinator and it's like week 1 is almost a different story than what we'll probably see at the end of the season, where it's like the long-term view. I completely agree with you. Like there is absolute ton of talent on this defense. I look at week 1, we're talking about a defense that plays a lot of man coverage. I mean, Jair Alexander is a good cornerback, no doubt. He certainly has had his flashes. Eric Stokes shows up incredibly well in a lot of metrics, kind of surprisingly. But I look at that matchup in week 1 against the Eagles, and I say, man coverage, this is something we've studied pretty well and pretty well documented over here at PFF, that it's effectively you strip out all of the isolated, you isolate on the players, and it's the better players are going to win. And this style of defense, I think, works, but a little less so when you're going up against A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. And certainly when we talk about tails cases, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Brown and Smith are going to have their way if you're playing in a really man heavy against the man heavy scheme, which isn't to say anything about the kind of long-term view of the Packers. Just that in the here and now, that's screaming as a betting angle to me of I want to load up on Hurts, Smith, and Brown. I think there's also an interesting element of those two guys that when they play well, usually they both do, because it's a function of the Eagles really relying on their passing game. And I got to think that's what Kellen Moore is going to be keying on here, which is that he's got to believe that he has the matchup advantage with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith going up against Jair Alexander and Eric Stokes.
Yeah, like you said, I have a lot of faith in Alexander and Stokes, but Brown and Smith are one of the best 1-2s in the league, right? So they're probably going to win those man coverage situations more often than not. And I also think game script wise, the Eagles are probably going to have to pass, because I have faith in the Packers offense against the Eagles defense. And I think this could be a game where we've seen the Packers are willing to kind of bully teams when they think they can in the run game. Right? And when you look at this Eagles defense, I think this is a situation where you look at Josh Jacobs. The Eagles were 28th against the run by EPA per play last year. Right, so kind of like the Chiefs. The thing is, they were so bad as a pass defense that teams just threw all over them. And there's a chance that there's improvement there. They've added some to their secondary. You get Isaiah Rodgers back from suspension. You draft Quinyon Mitchell. You draft Cooper DeJean. You have some more depth there. You get Chauncey Gardner-Johnson back at safety, right? So there's a chance that their pass defense is better than it was last year. And Green Bay just looks to run the ball at them, especially if you've got a guy like Bryce Huff as an early down edge rusher who has been a pass rush specialist. And I see a situation where Green Bay could look to challenge them physically in the run game. Yeah,
no, I think that's an interesting case. To me, what stands out is kind of this interior match or the matchup between in the trenches on the Packers offensive line versus the Eagles defensive line. And in some ways, I actually think it's a mirror of the question with the Eagles offense and their team in general from the last 2 years, which is the end of last season, right? Or excuse me, at last off season, if you kind of took a look at the Eagles pass rush, you're this is this ferocious unit, right? They draft Jalen Carter. They've got Hassan Reddick on the edge. I think Bryce Huff is probably just as good. Brandon Graham still is kind of churning it out. Jordan Davis is a top pick who is primarily a run guy, but still can kind of play well in the pass rush game. And I look at the Packers offensive line, and in my head, I'm thinking of the Rodgers days of these really solid offensive lines with David Bakhtiari and just rock solid units. Just if you quickly look at their PFF grades, it's not great.
It's not bad anymore.
There are weak links everywhere. And I think, right, you can kind of scheme up a lot of the rushing success, but I do have some concern here, or I shouldn't even say concern. It's more so I'm curious how this plays out of what looks to be a weak pass protection unit against what should be a much better pass rush unit, and one that struggled last year. But do you see Vic Fangio being able to kind of rejuvenate this pass rush? It hasn't changed that much on paper. Right, there isn't such a huge difference between Bryce Huff and Hassan Reddick. How are you kind of looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, you can argue potentially that Huff just purely as a pass rusher is better. His win rates are up there with the Garretts and the Parsons of the world. He's been dominant in that role with the Jets. And I think you probably do expect a bump from Jalen Carter. He started out the gates excellent in his rookie season, and it seemed like he kind of hit a wall. And that's been the discussion with the Georgia guys, is like, you're not playing a ton in college, you're rotating a lot, you're now being counted on to play heavy snaps. So I think getting into year 2, having a better expectation of that, right? You could see, I guess this is week 1, right? So that's less of a question, but you could see better play from Carter in the middle. And their pass rush should be one of the better units in the league. I think going against Green Bay, they're not quite in that Miami, San Francisco mold of just deterring pass rush completely through scheme, but I think there's some similarities there to where they can work around it.
Yeah, it was interesting. And I was looking at the NFC wildcard game last season between the Packers and Cowboys. There was like one chart which really stood out to me, which was that the Cowboys were by far the best in the league at generating quick pressure. That's pressure within 2.5 seconds. And the Packers were the best in the league at countering that, i.e. they saw it the fewest percentage of the time. And that kind of led me to betting on the Packers here. And I'm looking here and I'm like, is that sustainable? Is it not? I think you bring up a really interesting point about scheme here, which is perhaps some value that is not properly accounted for. It's like, this offensive line is not great on paper, but it probably doesn't matter as much. And sure, they might not be, Miami, San Francisco levels, but I think important to keep in mind. Do you have any, right? The Packers right now are, this game's in Brazil. First off, they're 2.5 point underdogs. Do you have any opinion here, just looking generally at the game? Any leans you're looking into, or are you kind of mostly waiting to see how things play out?
I'm leaning Packers in this game. I think I have more faith in their offense, right? And I know the Eagles have, like we talked about, right? You've got those elite skill position players, right? The Packers are going to play man. They're going to have opportunities to make big plays. I think I'm worried about some of the offensive line changes in Philly, and Green Bay has a very good pass rush, right? And I think what concerns me when you go back and watch Hurts the most is when he feels pressure, his first instinct is to escape out the back of the pocket, sprint to the sideline, cut off the field. You see a lot of throwaways, which aren't necessarily negative plays, but they're certainly not positive plays. And I think they're going to get in a situation where Green Bay can run the ball on Philly, and then the Eagles are trying to play from behind. And I don't love that matchup for them. Yeah,
no, that's compelling. I think I just keep going back and forth between the different points here. And I can't kind of take a macro view of this. I think the one thing that really sticks out to me is trying to take advantage of this angle of like the Eagles winning against a man-heavy unit and doing so through Brown and Smith, because I really think that's the kind of most compelling case for them to win. But I see angles on both sides of just like, this is an Eagles team that's like going through a new scheme. They are starting like two players that one of whom didn't play in the NFL last season. The other of whom's never played an NFL game before. Darius Slay's like getting up there in age. The secondary is a huge question mark. I kind of see that going both ways. I can really see this game, being a shootout. Lots of different interesting pathways for teams to put up points, players to put up yards. I think kind of ripe for betting on tail outcomes. Though I do find your kind of case for the Packers side.
I see both sides, man. It should be in a good one.
Well, that's kind of the idea here is like, if you talk through the games, it's one thing to kind of just like at a very high level say like, hey, I like one side or like for this particular reason. But I think playing through the different scenarios, and I think you really get that by breaking down each game as we're attempting to do right here, is you kind of see how different games can play out. You can form opinions based on like what we're saying, what you think, how that kind of plays live, just kind of training of like, what are the types of things I want to be seeing in order to kind of place a bet, or even just like enjoy watching a football game, because primarily that's what this is about. Moving on to next primetime game. This is one I'm super stoked about personally. I will also say probably my hottest take, my favorite tails angle.
Okay.
We're looking at the Lions and Rams. Okay, I think just to set the framework here, the Lions, like this is a team, and I mentioned earlier about the certainty and the role I think that should play in week 1 betting of like there are a few teams that we know, or like relatively speaking, we know a lot about. And there are lots of teams which are just like massive question marks, and you can really play off that variance. To me, the Lions are like the most known quantity. They almost broke the system, right? Like Ben Johnson was not supposed to be an offensive coordinator. Like he got to the point of success where he's supposed to be a head coach. The fact
they can't keep getting away with this.
They can't keep getting away with this. It's insane. But like what evidence can you get other than just like things are random in the NFL to say that like this isn't going to be a really good offense? They've got a terrific offensive line. They're returning 4 or 5 of their starters. I mean, Kevin Seiler will do a fine job, I think, over Jonah Jackson. It's just you got Amon-Ra St. Brown. You've got your quarterback. You've got your offensive coordinator and that scheme. And you look at the Rams side of the ball, and I kind of see the opposite of like they lost Aaron Donald. That's massive, right? And it's like one of the more difficult problems I think in football analytics generally is like understanding second order effects of players. Like you mentioned Lamar Jackson and the gravity that he holds in the run game. And PFF wrote a really compelling paper. We can link it, and I'd encourage our listeners to read it just about the gravity that a rushing quarterback has on the run game. But I think it's very difficult, and this is something we should study of like Aaron Donald obviously makes the pass rushers around him better. He makes everyone else around him better. And losing that and losing him is particularly hard to capture. Not to mention that this is a team that lost Raheem Morris. And defensive coordinators, I think, matter a lot. It almost seems miraculous that they were what, like 21st in EPA per play on defense last season. And like you look at their roster, and outside of Aaron Donald, there was like basically nothing.
Yeah.
And they lost Morris.
I was looking at their linebacker depth chart today, just trying to figure out who their linebackers were. And you got Rose Boone, Troy Reader, and Jake Hummel at the top of their depth chart. I pride myself on knowing NFL players. I had no idea who Jake Hummel was. And no disrespect.
I can't say I knew. But I think that kind of illustrates the point of like, this is a team that lost a lot. It's kind of starting effectively nobody. I think that's not great for their season-long outlook, but especially in like week 1 against the machine, that's the Lions, especially you talk about linebackers and the run game. Like Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be back and healthy. He says he's 98 to 100%. I don't really know what that means, but he'll be playing. And I just see this as a spot where I'm all over the Lions. Are you seeing anything similarly? How are you kind of seeing this game from a matchup perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I'm in complete alignment. Especially like you talked about some of the matchup angles with the Rams, and you go back to that playoff game last year. Goff from a clean pocket was 19 of 19 for 242 yards and a touchdown, right? And you lose Aaron Donald. So I understand you go and you draft Jared Verse, you draft Braden Fisk, like Kobe Turner. I think he's one of the better players on their defense, but I still struggle to see how they generate much pass rush. And when you combine that with just how good the Lions are at attacking the middle of the field, and we talked about the linebacker depth, guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, like I don't see a way where they don't have big games, right? And Goff doesn't have a big game, right? And maybe the Rams can keep pace on the other side through the passing game, but I think Detroit puts up a lot of points here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would just echo with some more kind of data in your favor there of like PFF charts like they chart every player of every game, and things you can kind of derive from that data are statistics like what's called perfect coverage, which is the when every player does their job effectively or doesn't screw up. Coverage is a weak link system, right? All you need is one guy to mess up, and the offense has a high likelihood of success. They were pretty bad there. They were also PFF charts what is like called, or what I've like deemed disruption, which is effectively the types of pressures that kind of force a quarterback off of his read or off of his progression. These are generally very quick, though sometimes you can have a pressure that, like, if it's a very long developing play and there could be pressure in 2.7 seconds, which is why it's not exactly the same as quick pressure. But if you add those two things up, you get this thing called disruption. So just to recap, it's either perfect coverage or the types of pressure that disrupts a quarterback off his rhythm. LA was really bad last season. They were like 35 in their disruption rate. The league average is about 40%. That's going to get worse. Aaron Donald is by far their best disruptor, i.e. of the ones that can create chaos. And the Lions on the other side of this, Jared Goff and honestly, it's been whomever's playing quarterback, even in the couple of games Goff hasn't played. Goff is third in the league in EPA with like a 0.5 when not facing disruption. He had it 65% of the time last season. I see that being more like 70, 75%. And it's almost like that's the most stable thing there is, right? If you like plot this on a graph, the people on the y-axis are like all of the best schemes that we would think. And this is a team that I see as just like, as you said, like there's going to be no pass rush. There's going to be, I think, very little disruption. Like they should have their way. The only way I really see this game as being close, frankly, is like what the Rams can do on offense, as you said. Like, or I think that's kind of the central question is like, are the Rams going to be able to keep up with the Lions? How do you see that matchup playing out?
Yeah, I think their offense was really efficient when you had Stafford, Kyron Williams, Puka, Cooper Kupp all healthy, right? And I do think Detroit is a team that you want to pass the ball on. Their run defense was much better last year. So I could see a scenario where the Rams do kind of keep pace. But Detroit got better defensively too. You bring in Carlton Davis, you bring in DJ Reader, you get some of these veteran pieces in there. So I think the Rams aren't going to get shut out, but I also think it's going to be a healthy lead through most of the game for Detroit.
Yeah, I'm with you here. I guess one question I had in things you see, do you see the Rams offense is effectively needing their rushing attack to be successful in order to kind of like generate their best offense? I think especially in like DJ Reader's questionable in this game, especially if DJ Reader plays. This was a Lions rush defense that was like top 5 in basically every run defense metric. Like DJ Reader has been an absolute tank. On-off splits are generally pretty noisy, but if you want to look at the on-off splits of what he was doing on the run defense, and it's drastic. Like this should be maybe the best rush defense in the NFL. And I think that's like a fairly confident take that I have is that they'll be able to slow the Rams down. Do you think that at all matters, or is it really just kind of a question of like, is Stafford going to play out of his mind again?
Yeah, I mean, he always could, but I do think it matters. Like we've seen the Rams run game evolve to where they're really just trying to run down people's throats through the A-gaps, right? A lot higher duo rate. They're kind of moving away from that outside zone, and we've seen their personnel changes on offense reflect that, bringing in big dudes like Jonah Jackson, like Kevin Dotson, Steve Avila in the draft, right? They're trying to really beef up that interior offensive line. And like a lot of those, like the Shanahan, McVay, LaFleur tree of offense, a lot of the stuff they do is built off progressions off the run game, right? So I do think if you get into a situation where the Rams can't run the ball at all, which I think is very possible, like you said, right? Especially if DJ Reader plays, it puts a lot on Stafford's shoulders. And I'm not in a position where I'm going to say he can't do it because he's been lights out the last couple of years, and they do have receiving talent. But it makes it a lot tougher for sure.
Yeah, no, I think we're mostly on the same page here. And I think when kind of looking at like how I'm planning to attack this from a betting perspective, I look at like my base, right? When we're looking at like means or medians or things of like looking at what is usually the spread or mainline markets, I kind of see the Lions as being mispriced, at least relative to the changes that we saw from the Rams side of things. And I like them there. I think if you're going to play the Rams side, I think it's almost got to be through Matthew Stafford. Like I can definitely see an angle of like Stafford basically putting the team on his back, and that's going to be like a Stafford all passing yards, whether it's Kyron Williams, Blake Corum, under rush yards, and the Rams to win. Like I think that's their only path here. Now, like I don't think it's going to come through the ground game, though. I still maintain that the Lions are probably kind of my favorite bet on the spread or the alt spread this week. I really think these teams are mismatched.
Yeah, I don't think it's consensus, but I think Detroit's the best team in the NFC. Right?
Whoa.
I think they're better than San Fran.
There we go. Episode 1 hot takes. I love it. Yeah, that's going to be a pretty fascinating team to watch. I think in some ways, and we're going on a little bit of a tangent here. It's hard to grasp their success in a way of like looking at this team on paper. Like they're getting production from like last year was like Josh Reynolds, right? Like Sam Laporta goes down, like Brock Wright's like basically picking it up. Not to mention that like Sam Laporta has quietly been historically good as a tight end, as a rookie tight end. I'm curious, like if you can kind of like explain, and you talked a little bit about duo, and I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with a lot of these concepts, but like if you had to give a very quick pitch of like what is it that makes the Lions offense so successful, and like in trying to explain and schematically like what is it they do, would be I'm super interested to hear that.
I think in the run game, I'll start there. It's the diversity in the run game, right? They're not one of these teams that is super high in one specific run concept, but they can do a lot of things and do them well. And there's kind of carryover from what we saw with the Saints, right? During late Drew Brees, obviously Campbell, there's a connection there. But they can run zone, they can run outside zone, inside zone, duo, they power counter, right? They can kind of do it all. And they have weapons on the offensive line like Penei Sewell, who you can use as a puller and get him out as a lead blocker in space, right? It's like him, Trent Williams. There's not a ton of the guys in the NFL who can do that the way he can. And then you build the passing game out to where they're so efficient attacking the middle of the field, right? And we talk about offenses like Philly, and it's more of a quarterback thing generally. So like guys like Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, who only attack outside. Golf is so comfortable hitting those windows over the middle of the field, right? And when there is those ideal situations to work from, which they work from a lot, like you said, because of the offensive line, because of the scheme, you see why he was the number 1 overall pick. It's part of why his career has been frustrating, because when he's outside in cold weather and things aren't perfect, it doesn't look that way. But they can really just they're so diverse in how they can beat you. And I think really that's what separates them offensively.
Yeah. So how do those things interact, right? Like how does the diversity in the run game kind of interact, if at all, with the ability to kind of generate this like production over the middle of the field? Are those things connected?
Yeah, I think so, because right, you're just the different ways you can beat teams in the run game. Defenses have to respect that. They have to respect it with bodies, right? It's not breaking any barriers here, but you draw people up in the run game to hit those windows behind. That's the whole idea behind play action. And I think with how successful Detroit is running the ball and how the variety of ways that they can do that, it just creates those windows. And you've got guys who live over the middle of the field, like their top receivers, all like Amon St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield, right? They're kind of built to attack those windows. And they do it really well.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome explanation. And I can come clean as kind of like a subplot. I think you hear a lot in like analytics circles, and like there's been some compelling research on the idea of like running the ball more does not kind of influence the effectiveness of play action and things of that variety. But I think that kind of misses the boat a little bit. And I think when you just even think conceptually about how these offenses are designed, like obviously these things are connected. And I think kind of understanding how the Lions scheme works, both interesting from a fan's perspective, and I'm a football nerd, so I love it, but also in understanding, like in looking ahead of like the fragility of this team, right? Like you mentioned, Penei Sewell is like an elite puller, right? Like that itself is not a skill that necessarily translates well. Like if Penei Sewell goes down, that matters more to the Lions run game than some other left tackle goes down for some other team. So I think kind of like actually having a deep understanding of how these teams operate, how it works, and like how these things also have second order effects, right? Like the ability to be diverse in the run game, which relies upon the talent that you have at the first place, also sets up this other thing, which is just like the Lions middle of the field passing game might not be the same without the rush game, the run game. And like you can run a bunch of like studies and like we're working with very small data. It's hard to kind of say anything conclusively when this is like pretty clearly apparent. And like at some point you're going to have to look at the production of a team and say like, why is it that they're successful? And I think the Lions are a super compelling case. And I think there's hopefully something to kind of take away from there. All right, moving on to
it's not always last point. It's not always play action either, right? Like even if you're going heavy and it's just straight drop back, like you're going to get draw forward from some of those defenders just because you got Penei Sewell and Frank Ragnow and all these guys blowing you off the ball and Jahmyr Gibbs and Montgomery in the backfield. So
this stuff all matters. And it does show up in the tracking data as kind of the paper we outlined earlier demonstrates. But moving on to a Monday Night Football game, we got the Jets and the Niners. Aaron Rodgers, Monday Night Football game with the Jets. What can possibly go wrong here?
Yeah, hopefully we get more than 4 snaps. Hopefully, but it's an interesting matchup, and I think I know Rodgers is kind of the headliner, but I'm more interested on the other side of the ball with San Francisco's offense against the Jets defense, right? Because those are 2 elite units, and I think there's some interesting schematic angles because you don't really think of Robert Saleh as a big man coverage guy. He comes from the San Francisco tree. But last year with the Jets, they were 5th in the NFL in cover 1 rate, right? Because you have Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter, who just became the highest paid slot in the league. You have the talent to do it. And you saw them do more of it. But teams don't play man against San Francisco because you've got an all-star receiving core. It's all the pre-snap motion, difficult to track guys across the field. You've got condensed formations where you can get rubs and different things that make man coverage difficult. New York didn't play San Francisco last year, but if you look at kind of their 2 games against Miami as a proxy, their man coverage rate was 15, or their cover 1 rate was 15% compared to 28% against every other defense. So you saw a lot less of it. So I think it's a situation where San Francisco is going to see more zone, and guys like Debo, all right, I think are going to be featured in this game. And I think you see that from San Francisco in big games against tough defenses where you're trying to get easy scheme touches to guys who can create on just a dump off. And I think you're going to see that a little bit from San Francisco here.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really a matchup of like strength on strength. Of like, I don't think, at least what I'm hearing, like in some of the circles that I run, is just like, oh, the San Francisco Niners offense is good. As opposed to like, this is an absolute house of a team. Like they are awesome. And like on the Jets side, they've had an incredible defense for 2 years running now, and they're almost like bucking a lot of the general trends. Right? It is generally true that defensive production is like unstable year over year. It is generally true that like cornerbacks are kind of a little bit like voodoo, but it's hard to ignore like Sauce Gardner has been almost historically good over the past couple of years. And when you look at the Jets fundamentally, like defenses are unstable partly because they're weak link systems for the most part. And like the players get hurt and you can like, it's very fragile in that way, but the Jets are incredibly deep, right? They have a ton of depth on the D line. They have a ton of depth in the secondary. It's a particular, and like to be like in week 1, that stuff doesn't really matter anyway, because like your guys are going to be healthy.
Well, unless they're holding out.
Unless they're holding out, though. I think we got Trent Williams back, but it really is a matchup of like strength on strength here. Do you think the Trent Williams holdout like really matters at all? Like I'm kind of the belief that like Kyle Shanahan's going to scheme up the run game and the pass game to basically make his O-line like effectively irrelevant. I mean, that's obviously not true. I'm saying that flippantly, but like there is some element of like Kyle Shanahan is this offensive wizard, and like the Niners are incredible. It almost doesn't matter what the defense is. And like my take is usually like if we have an elite offense going up against like an elite defense, you side with the elite offense, especially when the market kind of prices in the elite defense. But I'm not sure how I kind of hold on this one, because I think, as you said, like the Jets are played this particularly smart. Some teams are like, hey, we're going to play our style defense, like come at us. And like that to me is a recipe for a disaster. But I think this one has a little bit more quirks here.
Yeah, so Williams is back. He got restructured, but Hassan Reddick on the Jets side is not there.
Yeah.
So that hurts them, right? Especially because you lose Bryce Huff, you lose John Franklin Myers. So now you're relying on Will McDonald to take a big step, guys like Michael Clemens to fill in. But on kind of a bigger picture level with the Jets defense, I think part of what gives me confidence in them is like they were this good the last few years, and the offense wasn't doing anything. They were consistently putting them in bad situations. They weren't getting long on the sideline, right? And I don't think they were good in a lot of like kind of the luck metrics, like turnover. They were just fundamentally good, right? And they have talent at all three levels. But like you said, San Francisco is a juggernaut, right? I think really what the Jets have to hope for is they have to get pressure. San Francisco shredded the blitz. Right? The Jets don't blitz. 32nd in blitz rate. So you need that front four to generate pressure, and you need to hold up in coverage with 7 guys back in coverage and force Purdy to hold on to the ball. Because I think it's really hard to find any area where Purdy wasn't like top 5 in the NFL situationally. It was like play action, clean pocket, pressure, whatever. But it was a little bit lower when teams generated 4-man or a pressure with a 4-man rush, right? Because I think he's not a guy who wants to throw the ball away. So you have to force him into some mistakes there because he is a guy who's going to throw back across the field, try to make something happen because you've got Brandon Ayuk there with 3-4 seconds to get separation, right? But the Jets just have to hope for some mistakes there. It's easier said than done, though.
Yeah. No, I think that's almost a great framing of like how the game goes. It's just like you almost have to hope a little bit. And like this stuff happens. And like I post a lot of these charts on Twitter of just like digging through the suite of data that we have at PFF and kind of just like looking for things. And like, as you said, it's Brock Purdy is always in the top right of like the best quarterbacks. There's like one area of like his sack avoidance when scrambling like isn't great. And that's like the biggest knock you can have on him. But it's like the angle almost here has got to be like they get 4-man pass rushes and they start to like generate some sacks, generate turnovers. Like we know Purdy is definitely prone to that. And in some ways, I think the like game script matters a lot for that, which is like it almost is a narrative that builds on itself.
It's what Baltimore did, right? That's what you have to do on that Monday night game last year.
Yeah, just have Kyle Hamilton have a couple picks and you're all set.
Couple tip passes.
Yeah, exactly. But this is one I'm personally, I think, staying off just because I think there's a lot to learn about each of these teams. And I think the market's doing a pretty decent job of pricing in that, like, the Niners are a juggernaut. The Jets still have, I think, a lot to be determined. Obviously, everyone just wants to talk about Aaron Rodgers. Like, it's true. We don't really know how good he is. And everyone's like, oh, it's so clever. Like, Rodgers wasn't really that good a couple of years ago. I'm not doubting Rodgers. I kind of want to see some actual data on the field. This is a compelling supporting cast, I think, pretty quietly. We got to give our former PFF forecast participant Arjun now with the squad bolstering up the analytics department. This is a spot that I'm kind of laying off. Curious if you have any takes here.
Yeah, I think I'm a little higher on the Jets. I already mentioned that San Francisco, I do think there's some fragility to their defense, right? I think there's a chance that group takes a step back. And my thing with the Jets is, so they're the AFC East favorite, a really competitive division. And the knock on the Jets is, can they stay healthy? Well, they're healthy right now. This is as healthy as they're going to be. And I think it's a situation where Rodgers, like I said, he likes to live outside the numbers. You have Garrett Wilson, you have Mike Williams, you have these guys who can. And then out of the backfield, he also likes to hit those check down swing passes. Breece Hall, one of the better receiving backs in the league. I think this skill position group fits how he wants to play stylistically. And they revamped the offensive line, and the gap from Aaron Rodgers to the quarterback situation we saw with the Jets last year. I don't care if he's taking a step back at 39 or whatever he is. It's still a significant upgrade. So I just think 4.5, which is what it is now, is too much. Given that.
Yeah, no, I think that's reasonable. If you like force me to take a side, I would have to do it. on the Jets for, I think, precisely the reasons you're mentioning. It's definitely a compelling point here. Any other things from across the board of games that kind of caught your eye? I've got a couple of spots I have my eyes on just like very quickly. I'm looking at, I think Tennessee is in an interesting spot. I think the market is really kind of coming on to Chicago as like almost projecting Caleb Williams to be average, if not better. And I think that might be a little bit steep given where we're at and given the matchup specifically, where Chicago's offensive line is probably the weakest area for them. Caleb Williams' weakest area is probably in his sack avoidance. And Tennessee's strongest area is definitely on the defensive line with Arden Key and Harold Landry and Jeffrey Simmons. I think that's an interesting spot, especially given Will Levis is definitely going to be chucking it downfield. That I think really plays well into some angles there. Also, I guess I'm really going full on shout outs to former forecast. I guess if I just go on the show for a while, we'll be working for teams next. But I also really like
the way it works.
What was that?
I said that's the way it works for sure.
That's just the way it works. But I also like Carolina, of course. We got Dr. Eric Eager now, the VP of analytics there. I think that's a compelling spot for the Panthers. And I think the Saints have pretty quietly atrophied on defense. They're getting a lot older. They've basically been kicking the can down the road for the Cap for 10 years now. And it seems to, I think, finally be catching up to them a little bit. And obviously Carolina's in a new situation here, and kind of the asymmetric risk, if you will, is pointing towards Carolina being better, not worse. It's hard to be worse than they were on offense last year. And I think it's a big difference of going from Adam Thielen being your wide receiver 1 to Adam Thielen being your wide receiver 3. Not to mention, there's a possibility that Dave Canales is this kind of quarterback whisperer. There are more reasons, I think, for this to go right. That's a spot I'll definitely be looking on the alts. And the last one for me on thinking through kind of the same game parlays and alts is what I'm very curious your take here is Washington and Tampa. I see Washington as there's almost this Jaden Daniels preseason hype. I'm how many times are we going to go through the same thing of Trey Lance was really good in the preseason. Justin Fields was really good in the preseason. And I can list so many guys that are really good. Yeah, it's just this stuff happens every year. I think from a perspective of just looking at this organizationally, the floor for everything that Tampa is doing is, I think, going to be better than Washington. The defense is going to be a little better. You got to project this offense to be a little bit better. I don't think they're great, but at least relative to what Washington is. And I think Jaden Daniels is a massive, massive question mark. He especially has a massive tendency to take sacks, which I think matters a lot here. And I think can lead to a bunch of interesting angles just by virtue of Tampa running a bunch of plays. Washington was also a pretty big pass funnel last year, meaning they were much better against the run than the pass. If that forces, I mean, I think the run pass thing is a Todd Bowles concept because that's been, he did it with Brady. He did it with Mayfield. I think it's coming from up top. But if it forces them a little bit out of that, I think we can see Tampa have success in the passing game against Washington. Those are kind of the three spots I'm looking at. Curious your thoughts on those. If anything else was kind of jumping out to you.
Yeah, I think I like all of those, right? And the last game, Washington, Tampa, talking about Daniels make his NFL debut against Todd Bowles. Bowles is going to send the house at him, right? Oh, yeah. Repeatedly. So it's going to be interesting to see how he holds up there. I would wager not super well, but we'll see. On my end, I really like the Houston passing attack against the Colts. Not exactly shocking, but you look at the 2 games last year, Stroud went 648, 4 touchdowns, no picks. And okay. Not just that, but the underlying metrics. Stroud was our second highest graded quarterback against zone. No one's going to run more zone than Gus Bradley. He was excellent from a clean pocket. The Colts can't generate pressure. I don't really know in terms of receivers. I kind of want to wait to see how that shakes out in terms of Collins, Dell, Diggs. If I had to guess, I would say they're going to try to get Diggs going early. But that's just a guess, right? So I'm probably going to lean more towards just Texans and Stroud holdovers.
Yeah.
On the other one I like is over in Bills Cardinals. I think there's going to be, it's already one of the higher over-unders of the week, but I was just looking at these two defenses, man, and Buffalo loses Matt Milano. I think that's huge for them. The Cardinals cornerback group, like I know there's concerns about the Bills offense and their receiving core, but I think it's like Josh Allen is like a Patrick Mahomes light when you apply to the supporting cast. And they've still got some nice complementary pieces with Shakir and Kincaid and Cook out of the backfield and Coleman, what he can do. And then you compare that to what the Cardinals have in the secondary. It's Sean Murphy Bunting, is Starling Thomas on the outside. He was a UDFA in 2023, played about 250 snaps for Arizona last year. I just think both these defenses are going to be kind of rough, and both offenses can be better than people are kind of projecting. I talked about the Bills a little bit, but on the Cardinals side, I thought Drew Petzing did a lot of really nice stuff last year schematically for the Cardinals. And you're working with Josh Dobbs and you've got some limitations personnel wise, but you get a healthy Kyler who he could be in the conversation for one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the league. All right. Coming back, and you get Marvin Harrison Jr. in there as a true number one, some nice pieces around him with Michael Wilson, who I think did some nice things last year. Greg Dortch in the slot. All right. I think there's probably going to be a lot of points in that game.
Yeah. No, you even talk about Matt Milano. Don't mention my guy Trey McBride. I think that's actually one of my favorite props of the week. I don't think Buffalo could cover you if you were lining up at tight end for the Cardinals.
I think they could. I think they probably could.
Yes. Well, that's reasonable. And I do have to say also, you're coming out with your take about the Lions. I think that by this time next year, we will be firmly putting the Texans and the Chiefs in the same tier. I think that right now they're kind of being clustered together in this like tier 2 with maybe a Baltimore, a Cincinnati, a Buffalo. I see this the Texans team as one like really taking the next step. I think PFF Bobby's probably going to be looking at some head coaching offers next year. I think they really just have basically everything you need. And like the one weak point of this team is probably the offensive line. And I kind of trust the ability to scheme away from that. And what really gives me hope about the Texans offense, in addition to just like the obvious, like CJ Stroud's awesome, they have incredible wide receivers, is that if you look at kind of the pass rates for this team from the first half to the second half, which is just like as Stroud was getting more comfortable, as he was starting to have more success, the Texans really started to lean on him. And I think that really bodes well for this team. Kind of, they're going to, I think, be able to like, I'm not a huge Joe Mixon fan, but like, I think they're going to be able to run the ball well. I think like CJ Stroud is a burgeoning superstar in an awesome system and one that has a ton of talent, not to mention like D'Amico Ryans has done a great job with the defense. They have some real studs there, and I think the edge rushers this year in particular, and in Anderson and Hunter, should be great. Derek Stingley had an awesome turnaround year last year. I'm super excited for the Texans season.
Yeah, and I think on the like building slowly into the drop back game with Stroud like that makes complete sense, right? You have a rookie quarterback behind an offensive line that looked terrible on paper. You got to protect him, and then once you see he's the dude, like them showing that they would lean more into the passing game made a lot of sense and was promising for sure. Yeah,
no, this is awesome. I'm super excited for kind of this. This is going to be a weekly Thursday morning. Perhaps later on in the season we'll go live Wednesday night. It's obviously our first episode. We appreciate any feedback. We're working through this as we go along, but I'm super excited just to kind of give a little bit of a glimpse ahead. We will be returning on Sunday night, or I might maybe really early Monday morning to kind of recap the week 1 slate, some live reactions, some stuff to look ahead. We're going to have 2 shows on the betting podcast for now. We're going to do a Sunday Guest Alliance, and then Ben and I will be talking through some games on Wednesday or Thursday. Really appreciate it. We'll be back with you guys next week.